the night she was born. The moon did not shine. It hid behind a veil of clouds so thick, so deliberate, that the elders standing outside the birthing chamber lifted their faces to the sky and felt the first chill of it move through their bones, slow and deep, the way winter finds stone. In all their years, decades of births, of ceremonies, of howls that split open the heavens in celebration, they had never once seen the moon retreat. The moon was life. The moon was power. The moon was the very breath of the wolf gods themselves. But that night, it turned away, as if it already knew, as if even the heavens could not bear to witness the arrival of the girl who would one day bring them all to their knees. They named her Elara, not with pride, not with the trembling joy that moves through a father when he holds a daughter who smells of power and promise, not with hope stitched into every syllable. They named her Elara the way one names a stray, quietly, without ceremony, with the particular sadness of people who have already decided what something is, before it has had a chance to become anything at all. Because from the moment she drew her first breath, the elders knew no scent of strength rose from her skin, no flicker of wolf fire moved beneath the surface of her, no ancient power stirred the air the way it did when a true wolf entered the world. That electric, bone-deep recognition that made every wolf within a mile lift their head and listen. There was none of that. No cry shook the walls. No instinctive stillness fell over the animals in the surrounding forest. Only silence, only fragility, only Omega. And in a pack where power defined worth, where rank was everything, where the weakest were not merely overlooked, but actively reminded of their place. At every waking moment, Elara's fate had been sealed before she could walk, before she could speak, before she had drawn enough breath to understand that the world she'd been born into had already written her story, and in that story, she was nothing. Years passed. Nothing changed. If anything, it worsened. Elara grew into a soft-spoken young woman with dark, watchful eyes that carried too much gnawing for someone so young, eyes that had learned early to stay low, eyes that had catalogued every cruelty, every dismissal, every turned back and curled lip, and had chosen, again and again, to survive rather than to shatter. She was slender in the way that hunger makes a person slender, not delicate. There was nothing ornamental about Elara. She was slender the way a river reed is slender, bent by wind, shaped by pressure, but rooted deep where nothing could see. Her hair was dark and always simply kept, pulled back from a face that might have been called beautiful, if anyone had ever thought to look at it long enough. No one did. She moved like a whisper through the pack, present only when someone needed something fetched, something cleaned, something carried. She was the shadow that set the table before the feast, and cleared it after, the one who rose before dawn to haul water from the well, who tended the herb stores and the healing gardens, who repaired things quietly, so that no one had to notice they had broken. She was useful. She was invisible. And the pack, the great, proud, powerful Silverfang pack, made absolutely certain she understood the difference between the two. Move, Omega. Don't touch that, you'll only ruin it. Why are you standing there? Do you think you belong here? Every word landed like a blade dragged slowly across skin. Not enough to kill, just enough to remind the pack didn't simply ignore Elara. Ignorance would have been a mercy. Instead, they made a practice of her humiliation, casual, almost bored cruelty, the kind that comes not from hatred, but from something worse, the absolute certainty that she did not matter enough to hate. Children mimicked their parents. Warriors looked through her as if she were made of glass. Even the Omegas who ranked just above her, those desperate enough to need someone beneath them, took their turns. A shoulder check here, a spilled bowl there, laughter that followed her like weather. She bore it. She always bore it. Because somewhere beneath the layers of endurance and quiet survival, Elara had made herself a private promise that she would not break. Not for them. Not ever. They could strip her dignity 1,000 times over, and she would simply gather the pieces back up, in the dark of night, and press them into place with trembling hands. She would not give them the satisfaction of watching her shatter. But there was one who did not settle for casual cruelty. At the center of it all, the architect of Elara's particular brand of suffering, stood one chival. Lyra Vorse, daughter of the Beta, beautiful in the way that certain dangerous things are beautiful, sharp-edged, luminous, designed to draw the eye. Before they destroyed what looked too long, she had her father's authority and her mother's ruthlessness, and she wore both like jewelry. Her hair was the color of autumn leaves, her eyes a cold, calculated amber, and her smile, when it came, was always preceded by someone else's pain. She had decided, years ago, that Elara was hers to break. No one had questioned it. No one ever did. Well, look who crawled out of the shadows. Lyra's voice cut across the morning courtyard, perfectly pitched, caring to every wolf within range, every wolf who could turn, could watch. The pack's little burden. Tell me, Omega, did you remember to exist today? Or is that still an accident? Laughter followed. It always did. Elara kept her head down, gripping the basket of herbs she'd been carrying since before sunrise. Trying to pass. Just trying to pass. She didn't look up. She had learnt years ago that looking up was an invitation. That meeting Lyra's eyes was something Lyra considered a challenge, and challenges from Omegas were never allowed to go unanswered. But Lyra stepped into her path. She always stepped into her path. You walk like you're afraid of your own shadow, she said, tilting her head with the idle curiosity of someone examining something they'd found on the bottom of their boot. Tell me, Elara, do you even have a wolf? Or are you just pretending? Performing the motions of belonging to a pack? That would be better off without you. More laughter, a few murmurs of agreement. Someone near the back made a sound of amused contempt. Elara said nothing, because speaking made it worse. She had learned that lesson the hard way. The time she had spoken back. Once, when she was 14 and still full of a fury, she hadn't yet learned to swallow. The punishment had been swift and total and humiliating, and she had not made that mistake again. So she was silent. She was always silent. But what they could not see, what none of them ever saw, or thought to look for, was that her silence was not weakness. It was not the silence of a broken thing. It was the silence of something waiting, something patient, something that had buried itself deep enough in the dark that no one thought to check, whether it was still breathing, and deep within her chest, beneath the careful architecture of endurance she had built around herself like stone walls. Something waited, something old, something that had not yet been given reason to wake. The pack felt him before they saw him. That was always the way with Kale Draven. His presence moved ahead of him like a pressure change before a storm, a heaviness in the air, a sharpening of instinct in every wolf within range. Children stopped mid-play. Warriors straightened without being told. Conversations died mid-sentence, as something ancient and involuntary in every silver fang wolf turned its head toward the source. He'd been gone for 3 years. 3 years of wars beyond the Northern Territory, of alliances forged in blood and battle, of silences that his beta had filled with careful diplomatic letters that said very little about how Kale Draven had changed in his time away from the pack that raised him. 3 years of rumors that he had fought a bear-wolf hybrid bare-handed in the eastern mountains, that he had ended a rogue alpha's bloodline with nothing but a command and a stare, that he had come back from the north, carrying something in his eyes that had not been there when he left, something harder than iron and colder than the territory's worst winter. The rumors, it turned out, did not do him justice. Alpha Kale Draven returned on a Tuesday morning, grey sky above and frost still clinging to the packed ground grass, and the effect of his arrival was immediate and absolute. He moved with the unhurried certainty of someone who had never once needed to prove that space would be made for him, because it always was. Instantly, instinctively, without question. Tall, broad across the shoulder in a way that spoke of real work, real fighting, Real weight carried for real distances. The jaw was harder than before, his dark hair slightly longer, his eyes, storm grey and searingly direct, moving across the assembled pack, with the calm assessment of a commander taking inventory. He was 26 years old. He looked like something that had been through a war and come out the other side, not diminished but distilled, refined down to pure, terrifying essence. Every wolf lowered their head as he passed. Every wolf, except one, because one wolf didn't see him. Elara was kneeling by the stone well, at the far edge of the eastern courtyard, both hands wrapped around the rope of a water bucket that was roughly twice the weight it should have been for one person to manage alone. Her arms shook with the effort. Her breath came in small, careful pulls through her nose as she tried to leverage the bucket's weight against the stone lip of the well, tried to find the angle that would let gravity help her instead of fighting her. No one helped. No one ever did. The rope burned her palms. The bucket swung. She gritted her teeth and pulled harder, leaning back, legs braced against the base of the well, a small, stubborn figure, locked in a battle of pure will against dead weight. The weight lifted, not gradually, not with effort, all at once, effortlessly, as if the bucket had simply decided to cooperate, as if the laws of gravity had been politely asked to stand aside. The rope went slack in Elara's hands, and she stumbled backward half a step, confused. Before she looked up, the world stopped. The alpha of the pack stood next to an Amiga. Who was nobody? Who was nothing? Who was the shadow that moved through corridors and was forgotten before the door swung shut behind her? His hand held the bucket rope, his grip easy and absolute, one arm having done without effort what had been exhausting her for several minutes. His eyes found hers. They were extraordinary eyes. Not warm. Warmth was not a word that belonged anywhere near Kale Draven, but intense in a way that was almost physical. A grey so deep it read like the moment before a storm breaks, when the sky goes very still and very silent, and every creature on the ground holds its breath. He looked at her, and something impossible happened. Something that had no language in the rational world. Something that bypassed reason and rank, and 3 years of war-forged walls, and landed directly in the marrow, in the wolf instinct, in the place beneath all thought, where only truth lived. Her scent hit him, soft, subtle, barely there, like rain on warm earth, like something green pushing through snow. It should not have moved him. He had trained himself over years and wars, and deliberate, careful choices, to feel nothing he had not decided in advance to feel. But this moved him like nothing he had a name for. The single word rose in him like thunder building deep underground, in the ancient, wordless language of wolves and fate, and things older than the pack, older than his name, older than every wall he had ever built, around the part of himself he had decided, long ago, did not get to want. Mine. It detonated through him with terrifying clarity. Not a suggestion, not a question, a statement of absolute fact, delivered by something inside him that did not negotiate, and did not compromise, and did not care at all about rank or reason, or the unthinkable impossibility of what it was claiming. Elara felt it too. Not the word. She didn't have the alpha's instinct for the matrix ignition language. But the pull, the heat, the sudden suffocating awareness of him, as if the air between them had changed density, as if her blood had been reminded of something it had always known and been waiting to say out loud. Her heart slammed against her ribs, her breath caught in her throat like a small startled creature, and for the first time in her life, someone looked at her like she existed, not through her, not past her, at her, with the full weight of eyes that saw. It lasted 3 seconds, maybe 4. Kale released the bucket rope, the motion sharp and deliberate, like someone cutting a thread. Before it could tie a knot, his jaw tightened. Something moved behind his eyes. Recognition, refusal, and something that might have been the beginning of panic. In a man who did not allow himself to panic. "This changes nothing," he said. Low. Rough. The word directed more at himself than at her. The tone of a man issuing himself an order. He intended to follow. He turned away and walked, and did not look back, leaving Elara kneeling by the well, with a bucket she hadn't asked for help with, and a heart that was beating entirely too fast. For a girl who was supposed to feel nothing, and something dangerously close to hope, smoldering in her chest, like an ember she didn't know what to do with. Cale avoided her, relentlessly, deliberately, with the focus, surgical precision of a man who understood that proximity was danger, and had decided with characteristic ruthlessness to eliminate the variable entirely. If Elara entered the great hall for the morning meal, Cale was already rising from his seat, plate unfinished, eyes fixed on some middle distance. That had nothing to do with her, if their paths crossed in the corridors. Between the training grounds and the Alpha's war room, he turned before she could raise her head, rerouting without explanation, leaving nothing behind but the ghost of his presence and the particular cold that follows when something warm suddenly withdraws. The warriors noticed. The elders noticed, but no one said anything, because no one said anything to Caeldraven that he had not invited them to say. Inside, however, in the locked, lightless room behind the walls, he had spent years reinforcing the Alpha was at war. He had known, intellectually, that the mate bond existed. He had watched it happen to other Alphas, had seen powerful men reduced to something unrecognizable by the force of it, seen warriors who could face death without flinching, come undone by a single scent, a single glance, a single moment of proximity that rewired everything. He had watched it with the detached interest of someone who had already decided. It would not happen to him, could not happen to him. He was not built for that kind of surrender. He was built for control, for leadership, for the cold, clean certainty of a man who knew exactly what he was, and what his pack required of him. And what his pack required, what it had always required, was strength. Visible, undeniable, absolute. An Alpha's mate was not merely a partner. She was a symbol. She was the living proof of the Alpha's judgment. His power, his rightness. She stood at his side before the pack, and the pack looked at her and saw him reflected, saw his choices, his worth, his legacy. An Omega could not stand there. It was not cruelty, he told himself. In the sleepless hours before dawn, when he lay staring at the ceiling of his chamber, her scent somehow still ghosting the edges of his awareness. Even though he had not been within 30 feet of her, since that morning at the well, it was not cruelty, it was clarity. It was the pack's survival. An Alpha who chose an Omega for a Luna was an Alpha who had lost his mind to biology and abandoned his duty to reason. He would not be that Alpha. He refused. But Lyra Vorse, sharp-eyed, calculating, missing nothing, had seen what happened at the well. She had been across the courtyard when Cale arrived, positioned near the front of the assembled pack, with the confident ease of someone who had been preparing for this return for 3 years. She had dressed carefully that morning, deep green that complemented the amber of her eyes, had arranged herself in the kind of casual elegance that takes significant effort to appear effortless. She had been ready, and then Caeldraven had walked past her, without a glance, and stopped at the well. For an Omega, for Elara, the fury that moved through Lyra in that moment was so complete, so scalding, that she had to breathe through it carefully, had to keep her face arranged in its usual composed lines, while something inside her turned to pure, burning acid. She had spent 3 years building toward this. 3 years of positioning herself, of making herself visible to the beta, of ensuring her name was spoken in the right rooms, of being exactly what an Alpha's mate was supposed to be. Beautiful, powerful, politically valuable. The beta's daughter, with all the alliances that implied. And Elara. Nothing Elara. Nobody Elara. The pack's shadow. The Omega everyone had spent years reminding of her worthlessness, had been looked at, truly looked at, by him. That evening, Lyra found her. She always knew where to find her. Elara was behind the storage hall at dusk, sorting through crates of winter provisions alone, her breath misting faintly in the cooling air, her movements quiet and efficient, entirely unaware that she was being hunted. Lyra stepped around the corner of the building, and the temperature seemed to drop by several degrees. "He looked at you," she said. Her voice was soft, that particular softness that was worse than shouting, measured and precise, dripping with a venom that had been carefully concentrated into something far more potent than rage. "Don't think I didn't see it." Elara went still. "You're mistaken," she said carefully, not turning around. "He helped me with the bucket. That's all." The slap came without warning. Sharp. Sudden, the crack of it splitting the quiet evening air, like a branch breaking under too much weight. Alara's head snapped to the side. The pain came a half second after, bright and humiliating, blooming across her cheek like heat. She did not make a sound. She had learned not to make sounds. "Don't," Lyra said softly, stepping closer. "Lie to me." Elara finally turned to face her. Her cheek was red. Her eyes were steady. That was the thing about Elara that Lila had never been able to fully extinguish. No matter how many times she struck, no matter how many times she humiliated or cornered or reduced, the eyes never completely died. They went quiet. They went careful. But something in them refused, absolutely and stubbornly refused, to go out entirely. It infuriated Lyra beyond language. "You think you can rise above your place?" she whispered, leaning close enough that Elara could smell the expensive scent she wore. Jasmine, an authority, an entitled fury. "You think the Alpha would ever choose you? You, the girl who carries water and sorts roots, and exists on the edges of everything, because no one can bear to look at her directly?" Her eyes darkened, cold, absolute, the eyes of someone who has made a decision and intends to follow it, all the way to the end. "I will destroy you before that happens," she said. "I will take apart every small, fragile thing you have built for yourself, piece by piece, until there's nothing left. And when I'm done, when you are finally, completely nothing, I will stand where you could never stand, and no one will remember you existed." She held Alara's gaze for a long, deliberate moment. Then she smiled and walked away. Elara stood alone in the cooling evening air, one hand pressed lightly against her burning cheek, breathing through the pain and the humiliation and the familiar, exhausting weight of being someone else's target. But beneath all of it, beneath the ache and the anger she could not afford to show, something stirred, something that had been listening, something that was beginning, very slowly, to wake. For as long as Elara could remember, there had been Taryn, not a warrior, not powerful, not particularly ranked in any way that the Silverfang pack valued. Taryn was a healer's apprentice, quiet, gentle-handed, with kind brown eyes, and the particular patience of someone who had chosen consciously and deliberately to being soft in a world that rewarded hardness. He was the one who had, years ago, pressed a small pot of healing salve into Elara's hands, after a particularly bad encounter with Lyra, and said nothing about it, just met her eyes and nodded, a small private act of solidarity. That had meant more than he would ever know. He was her safe place, her only one, the only person in the entire Silverfang pack who saw her, not the Omega, not the burden, not the shadow, but her, Elara. The girl who recited the names of herbs under her breath when she was nervous, who had memorized the position of every star visible from the pack grounds, who laughed at her own quiet jokes when no one was listening. Who deserved, Taryn had told her once, with quiet, fierce certainty, so much more than what she had been given. She trusted him the way someone trusts the ground beneath their feet, completely, without question, which was why, when she walked into the small herb storage room on the edge of the healing quarters and found Taryn standing there with Lyra Vorse. Lyra, in her perfectly arranged elegance, one hand extended, a small glass vial catching the lamplight between her fingers. The world did something Elara was not prepared for. It cracked, not shattered, Not yet. Just cracked. A hairline fracture moving through the center of the one solid thing she had built her survival around. Taryn looked up, and he couldn't meet her eyes. That was how she knew, not Lyra's satisfied smile. Not the vial. Not the careful, practiced arrangement of the scene. The thing that told her everything, that moved through her like cold water through a wound, was the way Taryn looked at the floor. Elara, he said. Her name in his mouth sounded like an apology. It sounded like something breaking. I'm sorry. Taryn, her voice was very quiet. What is this? He finally looked at her, and what she saw in his face was worse than cruelty. It was shame. The particular shame of someone who knows exactly what they're doing, and he's doing it anyway, because they have decided in the end that their own survival matters more. They offered me a place in the inner circle, he said. The words came out thin and scraped raw. A rank, a real rank. Elara, I couldn't refuse. What does that have to do with me? She asked. Though some part of her already knew, some part of her had always known. That safety was borrowed, that the things she allowed herself to depend on had a cost she hadn't yet been asked to pay. Lyra stepped forward. She placed the vial in Taryn's hand. She said nothing. She didn't need to. Everything, Taryn whispered. He didn't look at Elara again. The pain came later, not immediately. First, there was only the quiet, terrible understanding of what had happened, the way the pieces arranged themselves, into a picture she could not look away from. She walked out to the healing quarters and onto the forest path she had always taken when she needed to be alone, the one that wound between the old pines, and came out in the eastern stream, and she was 300 meters into the trees before she felt the first wave of it. It hit her like fire under her skin. The poison, whatever Lyra had instructed Taryn to use, whatever careful, precise cruelty she had designed for maximum effect, moved through Elara's body like something alive and furious, tearing through her blood, burning along every nerve ending, with a ferocity that dropped her to her knees. In the pine needles and dead leaves, she tried to call out, couldn't. She tried to shift, to reach for the wolf that had always been silent inside her. That small, stubborn, enduring presence she had never been able to fully manifest, but had always felt. Nothing answered. The poison was suppressing it, deliberately, designed to target the wolf nature specifically, to cut her off from the only part of herself that might have fought back. She collapsed onto her side on the forest floor, cheek against cold earth, the trees above her spinning slowly, the last light of evening filtering green and distant. Through the canopy, betrayed, abandoned, dying, and entirely alone. The storm arrived the way grief does. Without announcement, without mercy, the sky opened with a particular violence of weather that has been building for days. Fat, cold drops of rain. That came first as warning, and then as punishment, soaking through the pine canopy and finding Elara where she lay on the forest floor, with the unerring precision of something deliberately aimed. Lightning split the distant sky. Thunder answered it seconds later, rolling across the territory, like the voice of something enormous and indifferent. Elara barely registered any of it. The poison had reached its peak, a burning so complete, so total, that it had moved past pain into something else, something that felt less like agony and more like erasure. Her body temperature had spiked and then plummeted. Her limbs had stopped responding with any reliability. Her breath came in shallow, hitching pulls that fogged briefly in the cold air, and then dissolved. She lay still, for the first time in her life, the first time in years of endurance, and quiet survival, and stubborn, relentless refusal to break. She stopped fighting, not because she had given up, but because there was simply nothing left to fight with. Maybe they're right, she whispered into the dark, into the rain and the mud, and the indifferent forest that surrounded her. Her voice was barely sound, barely more than shaped breath, directed at no one, received by nothing. Maybe I am nothing. Maybe I was always nothing, and I just refused to see it. Her vision blurred. The trees above her softened at the edges, their shapes bleeding into the grey sky. The world losing definition, the way things do. When a person is moving towards something they cannot come back from. Her breathing slowed. The cold crept inward, through skin, through muscle, toward the center of her, where something small and stubborn had been burning for years, the last ember of the person she'd refused to stop being. And then,
the moon broke through the clouds.
not gradually, not the slow, tentative emergence of moonlight, finding its way between breaking storm clouds. Sudden, complete, a shaft of silver light so direct, so deliberate, that it could not be mistaken for accident. It fell through the pine canopy and landed on her, and nowhere else, a column of pure cold light that touched her upturned face, and her rain-soaked hands, and the mud-covered curve of her shoulder, with something that felt impossibly like recognition, like finding, like the moon saying, "There you are, I've been looking for you." It touched her skin, then deeper, her blood, her bone, her wolf nature, that the poison had suppressed and silenced and tried to smother entirely. Her very essence, and something ancient, something that had been waiting, with a patience that dwarfed even Elara's own considerable endurance. Something that had been dormant, not because it was weak, but because it had been waiting for exactly this moment. This depth, this absolute bottom, awakened. It began in her chest, a warmth that was nothing like the burning of the poison. Not destructive, not corrosive, but generative, building. The difference between fire that consumes and fire that forges. It moved outward from the center of her in waves, pushing against the poison's hold, the way spring pushes against frost. Not with violence, but with an inevitability that could not be argued with, could not be reasoned with, could only be yielded to. The poison fought it. For a few long, terrible seconds, the two forces warred inside her body, with Elara as their battlefield, the cold, deliberate suppression of Lyra's carefully chosen weapon against something far older, far more fundamental, far less interested in being suppressed. The poison lost, not gradually, all at once. It broke apart inside her like ice shattering under pressure, the pieces of it dissolving into nothing, and in the space it left behind, the sudden, vast, breathtaking space of a body that had just remembered what it was. Something extraordinary rushed in. Power. Real power. Not the performance of it. Not the social currency of rank and hierarchy that the Silver Fang pack mistook for the real thing. Something older than their hierarchies. Older than their politics. Older than the Beta's bloodlines. And the Alpha's wars. And every cruelty that had ever been visited upon a girl who carried herbs in a basket and kept her head down and refused to break. Pain became power. Weakness became fire. Elara opened her mouth, and what came out was not a scream of suffering. It was transformation. The sound tore through the forest and scattered every bird from every tree. Within half a mile, a sound that the oldest wolves in the pack, hearing it from the distant warmth of the great hall, would later describe with pale faces and wide eyes as the sound of something returning to itself. After a very long exile, her wolf emerged, not the small, fragile, barely their presence she had always sensed in the deep interior of herself, the flicker she had learnt not to hope for, a wolf that had never fully answered when called. What emerged was nothing like that ghost. What emerged was immense, silver-white, luminous in the moonlight, that still fell on her and only her, fur like woven light, eyes burning with a gold so deep it was almost amber. Ancient eyes, knowing eyes, eyes that held the particular calm of something that has always known exactly what it is, when it's simply been waiting for the world to catch up. She stood, not stumbled, not clawed her way upright, stood with the effortless, absolute certainty of a creature that has discovered, in the most complete way possible, that it was never broken, was never weak, was never the nothing they had spent years trying to convince it to be. The storm still raged above the canopy, but around her, in the small moonlit clearing, where an omega had collapsed, and something else had risen, the air was perfectly still. Kale felt it from inside the pack grounds. He had been in the war room, reviewing territorial reports with his beta, performing the focused attention of a man who was absolutely not thinking about an omega with dark eyes and rain-soft skin, who somehow, inexplicably, impossibly, occupied more of his waking thoughts than 3 years of war had managed to claim. Then it hit him. The surge. A pulse of power so sudden and so enormous that it went through the war room's stone walls, like they were paper, went through his carefully constructed composure, with the same ease, and landed in the wolf instinct at his core, with the force of a detonation. His beta stopped mid-sentence. Kale was already on his feet, already at the door, already in the corridor, before any conscious decision had been made. His wolf, the enormous, battle-hardened, silver-grey wolf that had faced things in the northern wars, that would break most wolves entirely, was pulling toward the forest, with an urgency that could not be reasoned with. Mate. Now. Go. He went. He found her at the edge of the forest, where the tree line broke, and the packed ground grass began. Standing. Just standing. But standing in a way that stopped him 30 feet away. That made him, for the first time in longer than he could remember, hesitate. She was silver in the moonlight. Her wolf form was... He had no adequate category for it. He had seen powerful wolves. He was a powerful wolf. He knew what power looked like in lupin form, had catalogued it across years and territories and battles. What he was looking at was something outside his existing categories entirely. Silver-white. Radiant. Perfectly still, with eyes that held a quality he could only describe as ancient, like looking into something that remembered things his bloodline had forgotten. The mate call hit him again, stronger now that she was shifted, stronger now that her true nature was fully present and unmasked and blazing. And this time, Kale Draven, alpha of the Silver Fang Pack, 3-year veteran of Northern Wars, the man who had never once allowed his wolf to override his reason, did not fight it. He shifted. His wolf crossed the distance between them in 3 strides, and stopped, close enough to breathe at the same air, and then did something that Kale's wolf had never done for anything living. It lowered its head, not in submission, in recognition. Elara's wolf regarded him for a long, still moment, those ancient eyes moving over him, with an assessment that was entirely her own, that borrowed nothing from fear or rank, or the years of conditioning that had told her she owed deference to every wolf she encountered. Then they shifted back, both of them, the moonlight still holding, as they stood in the grass at the forest's edge, human again, breathing the cold night air, close enough that Kale could see the remnants of what she had just survived, the pallor of poisoning still fading from her skin, the mud and rain still marking her, the evidence of what had been done to her. While he had been deliberately, carefully, cowardly looking away, something moved through his chest that had no name he was willing to give it yet. Elara, he said. Her name in his mouth felt like the first honest thing he had said in weeks, like setting down something heavy, like coming to the surface after too long underwater. She turned, and for the first time, for the absolute first time, in all the months and years and lifetimes of her existence in this pack, she did not lower her eyes. She met his gaze and held it, with a steadiness that made something in him ache, because he understood, looking at it, exactly what it had cost her to preserve that steadiness, exactly what kind of sustained, relentless pressure had been applied to it for years, and exactly how extraordinary it was that it existed at all. You left me to be destroyed, she said, quietly, without accusation, which was somehow worse than accusation, just the simple, clear statement of a fact she had decided to name out loud. His chest tightened. I didn't understand. No, she said, and there was no heat in it, no anger, just precision. The kind of precision that comes from having thought something through completely, from having had nothing to do, while dying in a forest, but arrive at absolute clarity. You didn't want to. The silence between them filled with everything that sentence contained. He could not argue with it. It was true. He had chosen not to understand, had chosen the convenience of willful ignorance, had decided that the political impossibility of what the bond was claiming was sufficient reason to leave her to navigate it and its consequences alone. "You're right," he said. The two words came out roughened, stripped of the Alpha's usual authority, not because he had lost it, but because he had chosen deliberately to set it aside, to speak to her as something other than a rank, as something she deserved, and that he had withheld. Her eyes moved over his face, reading him with the careful attention of someone who has learned not to trust easily, and applies that learned caution even now, even here, even to the thing her own instincts are pulling toward, with an insistence she can feel in her blood. "I feel you," he said. The admission came from somewhere below language, from the wolf truth that his human pride had been suppressing for weeks. Every moment, every breath. "I feel you, Elara, and I have been running from it, because I am a coward, wearing the face of a reasonable man, and I'm done." She was quiet for a long moment. The moonlight moved between them. Then she stepped forward, slowly, deliberately, each step chosen, not the stumbling compulsion of someone surrendering to a bond they can't resist, but the conscious eyes-open movement of a woman deciding, walking towards something she had examined from every angle and chosen. "And now?" she asked, when she was close enough that he could feel the warmth she radiated, close enough that her upturned face was tipped toward his, with a question in it that contained everything. Everything she was, everything she had survived, everything she was willing or unwilling to offer, depending on what he said next. Kale's control. The carefully engineered, battle-tested, 3 years reinforced architecture of it came apart, not violently, not with the drama of something destroyed, with the quiet, definitive sound of something that is held long enough and is finally, gratefully, allowed to rest. "You are mine," he said. She tilted her head. "No," she said softly, and there was something in her voice. Warm, certain, the first warmth he had heard from her, curled around a core of absolute steel. "I am my own first." The silence that followed was the most complete thing Kale Draven had ever inhabited. And then he did something that 3 years of war had not managed to produce, that no battle and no loss and no extremity of circumstance had extracted from him. He smiled. Small, real. The smile of a man encountering something he did not know he needed, until it was standing directly in front of him, looking at him like he was allowed to be more than what he had made himself into. "Yes," he said, "you are." And in that moment, with the moon above them, and the storm dissolving, and the forest quiet at their backs, he fell, completely, irrevocably, without a single reservation left standing. The morning came cold and clear, the storm scrubbed from the sky, the pack grounds glittering with the aftermath of the night's rain, and Kale Draven stood before his assembled pack, with Elara at his side, not behind him, not at a respectful distance, at his side, shoulder to shoulder, or as close as their height difference allowed, her chin level, her eyes forward, her presence beside the alpha of the Silverfang pack. So improbable, so impossible, so utterly against everything the pack had been told to believe was possible, that it produced a silence, unlike any of the pack grounds had witnessed before. Then the murmuring began, then the disbelief. Then Lyra Vorse pushed through the front of the assembled wolves, brittle, defiant, the energy of someone who has not yet accepted that the game's over, who is still playing, still calculating, still certain that there is a move available to her that changes the outcome. "This is a trick," she said. Her voice rang across the courtyard, clear, certain, performing the confidence she no longer fully felt. "Whatever this is, Whatever she's done, whatever she's used, it's a manipulation. She is still nothing. She will always be nothing. An Omega cannot stand where she is standing. Several wolves shifted uncomfortably. Some nodded. Some looked at the ground. Kale said nothing, because it was not his moment to speak. Elara stepped forward. One step, deliberate. The air around the pack grounds moved as she moved. A subtle shift in pressure, in the electric quality of the atmosphere. The way air moves before lightning finds its target. The wolves nearest to her stepped back involuntarily, not from fear exactly, but from the instinctive recognition of something their bodies understood before their minds caught up. Power. Real, unassailable, moon-given power. "Look at me," she said. Her voice was quiet. It didn't need to be loud. It moved across the assembled pack. The way sound moves across still water. Perfectly. Completely. Reaching every shore. And they looked. They could not do otherwise. Lyra's eyes widened, because this was not the Elara she had spent years breaking. This was not the shadow, the whisper, the girl with the basket of herbs, who kept her head down and said nothing, and survived by making herself small. This was something she had no framework for. Something that wore Elara's face, but stood in Elara's body, with an authority that had nothing to do with rank, and everything to do with something older and more fundamental than rank had ever been. "You spent years telling me what I was," Elara said, "and still that quiet, that absolute, unshakable calm. You spent years making certain I knew my place, that I stayed in my place, that I believed in my place." She held Lyra's gaze. "I believed you," she said. "For a long time I believed you. And I want you to know that. I want you to understand that the cruelty worked. That there were nights I lay awake wondering if you were right. If I was what you said I was. If the silence and the smallness and the nothing were the truth of me." Lyra's jaw tightened. Her hands curled at her sides. "But here is what I know now," Elara continued, and something shifted in her eyes. A light that had nothing to do with anger, and everything to do with the particular peace of someone who has finally arrived at themselves. "After a very long journey, I was never weak. I was patient. I was never nothing. I was waiting. And what I was waiting for was not permission from you, or from this pack, or from anyone who ever decided. They had the authority to define me." She raised her eyes to the assembled wolves. "I was waiting for myself." The silence that followed was sacred. Lyra attacked. It was desperation. Pure, cornered animal desperation. And it had none of the calculation that usually characterized her. She lunged forward in a half shift, claws extended, eyes blazing with the fury of someone who has lost everything and is trying to take something with them. On the way down, Elara didn't flinch, didn't step back, didn't raise her hands. She simply looked at Lyra, looked at her with those ancient, moonlit eyes, and the power that moved through her in response was not aggressive, not violent, not the brute force of dominance. It was truth, the kind of truth that cannot be argued with. Lyra collapsed, not unconscious, not physically broken, but broken in the way that matters most, the internal architecture of lies and cruelty, and constructed superiority that she had built her entire identity upon, collapsing under the weights of what she had just witnessed, just felt, just been made to understand, without the possibility of comfortable denial. She knelt in the dirt of the pack grounds, where Elara had knelt so many times before, and the pack watched and understood. Kale knelt first. He dropped to one knee in the center of the pack grounds, before every wolf who had ever looked through Elara, every wolf who had laughed at Lyra's cruelty, every warrior who had used her as an example of what not to be. And he knelt with the ease of a man who has made his decision so completely that there is no residual pride fighting against it. Then the beta second. Then, in a wave that moved through the assembled wolves, like wind moving through grass, like something inevitable finally completing its motion, the pack, one by one, and then all at once, The Silver Fang pack knelt before the girl they had spent years mocking, the girl who had carried their water and sorted their herbs, and moved through their corridors like a whisper, and borne their cruelty with a silence they had mistaken for weakness. The girl the moon had chosen. The girl, not once, in all the years of endurance and pain, and patient, unbreakable survival, stopped. Kale rose and turned to face her, and in front of his entire pack, with the winter sun now fully risen above the pack grounds, and the last of the storm clouds dissolving at the horizon, he took her hand, not with ceremony, not with performance, with the simple, absolute certainty of a man who has located the thing he was always moving toward, even when he was moving away from it. Elara, he said, his voice carried across the silent grounds, not as an omega, not as a rank, not as anything the hierarchy of this pack has ever defined you as. He lowered his head. As my equal, as my mate, as the one the moon herself chose, to stand where you are standing. He raised his eyes to hers. Rise, he said. My Luna. The silence lasted one full, sacred breath. And then Elara, the girl the moon forgot, the girl who had carried herbs in a basket and said nothing, and survived everything, the girl who had been told her entire life that she was nothing, and had believed it some nights, and refused it others, and had ultimately arrived, through pain and betrayal, and poison and moonlight, at the absolute, unshakable knowledge of what she actually was, looked at him, and smiled, for the first time in longer than she could remember. A real smile, not the private, internal smile she reserved for her own dark hours, not the careful, hidden warmth she'd allowed herself, when no one was watching. A full, genuine, luminous smile, given freely, in front of everyone, claiming the joy she had earned. I was never not standing here, she said quietly. And Kale, Alpha Kale Draven, the man who had faced wars and came back harder, felt something move in his chest that he recognized, finally, as relief. The particular relief of a man who has been carrying the weight of his own resistance for so long that he had forgotten what it felt like to set it down. He brought her hand to his lips and held it there, and the pack bore witness. The night after the ascension, the moon rose full. It always rises full, the old wolves would say afterward, when something the moon has been holding finally arrives, as if the sky itself keeps track of debts and pays them on the night they come due. Elara stood at the edge of the pack grounds, alone for a moment. Her moment, before the celebrations and the ceremonies, and the new reality of what her life had just become, swept her fully into its current. She tipped her face up to the moon that had hidden on the night of her birth, and found her in a forest when she was dying, and claimed her before an entire pack that had spent years deciding she was nothing. She breathed. The air was cold. The stars were very bright. You took your time, she said to the moon, not bitterly, with the fond, wry tone of someone addressing an old friend who had shown up exactly when they were needed, and not a moment before. The moon, as moons do, said nothing, but the light on her face felt, somehow, like an answer. Kale found her there. She felt him before she heard him, felt the particular warmth of his presence that her wolf instinct now recognized, the way lungs recognize air, and he came to stand beside her without a word. He was comfortable with silence now, in a way he hadn't been a week ago. The silence between them had changed texture, from the silence of avoidance to the silence of people who don't need to fill every moment with noise, because the presence itself is sufficient. How are you? He asked eventually. She considered the question seriously. Strange, she said, but the right kind of strange. The kind that means everything has moved. He nodded. He understood that. Taryn, she said, and she felt, rather than saw, the way he stilled beside her. The question of what she would ask for, regarding the friend who had betrayed her. Whatever you want, he said. Whatever you decide. She was quiet for a long moment. He was afraid, she said finally. He made a terrible choice because he was afraid. I understand that. I have spent years making careful, small choices. Because I was afraid. A breath. I don't want him punished. I want him watched. I want him given the chance to become something other than what fear made him that night. Kale looked at her with an expression. She was still learning the name for the one that moved through his face. When she said something that reminded him again of the specific quality of her that he had no adequate word for. Not just strength. Strength was common enough in the Silver Fang pack. This was something rarer. Grace. Done, he said. She turned to look at him then, fully, the way she was still getting used to being allowed to look at things without guardedness. His face in the moonlight was different from his face in daylight. Softer, not weak. Kale Draven was constitutionally incapable of looking weak, but accessible in a way that was entirely reserved for her, a frequency she was apparently the only one who could tune to. I need you to know something, she said. Tell me. I don't need you, she said. I need you to understand that. I survived before you. I would have survived. Found myself with or without the bond, with or without the more recognition, with or without any of this. I was always going to arrive here. It might have taken longer. It might have looked different, but I was always going to arrive. He held her gaze. I know. I choose you, she said. That's different from needing you. I choose you. Every morning I will choose you. And I need I need what's between us to be built on that. On choice, not on bond compulsion or hierarchy, or what the pack expects an alpha and his Luna to be. Yes, he said. And then, after a moment, quietly, with the particular honesty of a man who has recently learned what honesty costs, and decided it is worth every penny. I choose you too, for what it's worth, and I know it may not be worth much yet. Given the evidence, I choose you, not the bond, not the Luna, you, the woman who told me she was her own first, and was absolutely right. Elara looked at him for a long moment. Then she stepped forward and closed the remaining distance between them. And when he pulled her against him, arms around her, with the careful, deliberate gentleness of a man who understands that gentleness is not weakness, but the most demanding form of strength, she let herself be held, fully, without guardedness, without the careful architecture of protection she had spent years building around herself. She let it down, all of it, and nothing terrible happened. The world did not take advantage of her softness. The sky did not fall. No cruelty came to find the gap in her defenses. There was only the warmth of him, and the cold of the night air, and the moon above them, shining, finally, freely, fully shining, on the pack grounds of the Silver Fang pack. The girl they mocked was gone, not erased, not forgotten, transformed. She had been broken and betrayed, and poisoned and left for dead in a forest. And she would have risen from all of it, wearing moonlight like a crown, because she was never weak. She was never nothing. She was never the Omega they decided she was, before she had drawn enough breath to be anything at all. She was Elara, chosen by the moon, claimed by the Alpha, but most importantly, most fundamentally, most completely, and irrevocably, belonging to herself. The Omega everyone mocked had become Luna.